AMC's Interview with the Vampire is a show that's doing a lot. It's a contemporary adaptation of a beloved classic book and movie, a piercing exploration of queerness, race, and identity over the centuries, and a delightfully horrific vampire drama dripping with campiness, humor, and tragedy. But I think that one of the things it does best is that it tells stories about the way that we tell stories. This was something that was always present in the source material. All of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books are framed as having been written by one of her vampire characters, like a diary entry or an autobiography. Depending on which perspective character is at the helm, you can find differences in tone, prose, and even the actual events of previously told stories. But the show takes that foundation built by Anne Rice's books and builds them up to entirely new heights. By deconstructing traditional narrative frameworks, AMC's Interview with the Vampire begs important questions about the role of the narrator, the fallibility of memory, and the ways in which the stories that we tell become the people, or vampires, that we are. In this video, I am going to be covering material from all 3 seasons of the show, up into episode 4 of season 3, also known as the Vampire Lestat, so beware of spoilers ahead. Also, I'm gonna have to get rid of these fangs, because if I try and do this whole video with them in, it will take me days. But I will say that it has not taken me days to learn a little bit more about coding, thanks to this video's sponsor, boot.dev. Boot.dev uses a hands-on RPG-like experience to help you learn everything that you need to know about software development. They make learning coding feel just like a game, and even if you're as hopeless at technology as I am, it can still help you out. Boot.dev will help you learn back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go. And you won't just be working in a fake sandbox, you're going to be learning real skills in a real hands-on environment, just like you would on the job. There's a free demo available for the interactive experience on every one of their courses, and they have a Discord community filled with real humans that can help you out if you ever get stuck on anything. A paid membership with boot.dev unlocks features like hands-on coding, progress tracking, and game mechanics, and they have a 30-day no-questions-asked refund policy. You can check them out at the link in my description, or go to boot.dev and use my code JessofTheShire to get 25% off your entire first year on the annual plan. Thank you so much to boot.dev for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Although AMC's adaptation of the Vampire Chronicles certainly takes a few of its own liberties with the source material, the idea of this being a story fundamentally shaped by narrative voice is quite well founded in Anne Rice's works. To give you a staggeringly brief overview of narrative theory, every story has a narrative voice, and thus it has a narrator. Even if it's not explicitly stated that you're listening to a narrator, the very fact that you're being told a story at all implies the presence of one. Thus, this is usually called the implied narrator. The voice of the implied narrator may sound like the actual author's voice and agree with their viewpoints, or it may intentionally deviate from their perspective, but it is generally up to the implied author to establish what counts as true in a given fictional narrative. You can have more than just an implied narrator. For example, you can have what's called a heterodiegetic narrator. Hetero means other, and diegetic means of the story, so thus that means a narrator who is outside of the story. For an example of this, you can look to Scheherazade from 1001 Nights. You have a character's voice that is separate from the implied narrator, but she is not a part of the story that she tells. Now, contrasting the heterodiegetic narrator is the homodiegetic narrator, a character who is also inside of the story. Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles all make use of this homodiegetic narrator. The first entry is Interview with the Vampire, and it is posed as an interview with a vampire. The undead Louis de Pontdulac sits down with an interviewer to tell his life's tale. The interview and the interviewer in this story essentially act as a frame. They are the impetus and platform for Louis to tell his story. The interviewer asks very simple leading questions like, what happened to Lestat? Or what do you mean by that? But he does essentially give Louis free rein of the conversation. Louis's story plays out entirely unexamined, and the audience is never left wondering if Louis's accounts may deviate from the truth of the implied narrator. It isn't until the next novel that we begin playing with this concept. Following the interview of the first novel, Louis's account is published as the book Interview with the Vampire, and it sees widespread popularity. It finds its way into the hands of Lestat, who rather disagrees with Louis's accounts of their story. He decides to set the record straight and tell his own story in the second novel of the Vampire Chronicles, The Vampire Lestat. While much of the novel is original material exploring Lestat's eventful past, he also goes to great lengths to present a more truthful version of his character, shaking off the bias that Louis bestowed upon him in his version of events. While Louis had portrayed his relationship with Lestat as a tense, toxic cohabitation, Lestat claims to have quickly fallen fatally in love with his fledgling vampire. While Louis's versions of events skirted around the exact nature of their relationship, Lestat thinks of it as explicitly romantic. While Louis was consumed by mulling over the most terrible moments of their time together, Lestat points out that the horror was punctuated by moments of profound beauty. He, Claudia, and Louis had made up a little family, a closeness and longevity of bond that was incredibly rare amongst their kind. Now, Lestat doesn't call Louis a liar for all of these discrepancies between their memories of events. He just explains that it was Louis's disposition to see the world as a terrible place. He saw the worst in everything. As he says it, Louis told the tale as he believed it. Here, Lestat is admitting that when it comes to the accounts of these homodiegetic narrators, there will never be the strict truth. There will only ever be the truth as the narrator saw it. This theme continues to run through the background of the Vampire Chronicles books, especially when those books cover the same events with different narrators. One of the clearest examples is in the telling of the events of the vampire Armand's origins in Blood and Gold and The Vampire Armand. There will be brief spoilers for both of those books ahead. Blood and Gold is the memoir of the vampire Marius, an older vampire who found Armand in a brothel, raised him, and groomed him into a romantic relationship when Armand was only a teenager. Although Marius admits to some guilt regarding his treatment of Armand, the way that the two of them remember their relationship is unsettlingly and subtly different. Take, for instance, the moment before Armand's turning. In The Vampire Armand, Marius is quoted saying, "You will die now to be with me in life eternal," he whispered in my ear. "Never for a moment must you really fear. I will hold your heart safe in my hands." Now, Marius's account in Blood and Gold records him saying, "Don't be afraid, child, not even for a moment. You'll die now to live forever as I take your blood and give it back to you. I won't let you slip away." I think that Armand's account of his turning reads as much more specifically romantic in tone. Marius says that Armand will not just be in eternal life, but be with him in eternal life. Marius whispers to him. He says that he will hold Armand's heart safely in his hands. It is language that implies that Marius is turning Armand specifically to be a companion for him. Now, Marius seems to have had a different interpretation of events. He calls his fledgling child, shrugging off the romantic connotations of their relationship, and he makes no specific claims about them being together in immortality. This reads as far less intimate and far less like Marius is promising his fledgling an eternity together. Later in the story, Marius and Armand are torn apart, and Marius never makes any attempts to reunite the two of them. To Armand, who heard promises of forever in Marius's words, this is crushing. To Marius, who recalls no such thing, it's par for the course. We don't know which of these accounts is true, according to the truth of the implied narrator, but their differing recollections tell us a lot about who they were and the way that they saw each other. Not every one of the Vampire Chronicles entries makes full use of the possibilities of the homodiegetic narrator, but it is an underlying theme in the series. A story can change greatly depending on who is telling it and why. These unreliable narrators work so well in these books because they are being presented to us through books, rather than, say, film. The trope of the unreliable narrator has become common fare for readers, and it works so well because of the unique characteristics of the medium. When you read literature, you're told what's happening, and then you must rely on your imagination to bring that story to life. In a given scene, you may not be told specifically that your main character has brown hair, but when the character was being introduced 100 pages ago, you were told that they have brown hair, and so when you read a scene later in the book, you extrapolate that that must still remain the case. Now, film does not require that kind of same mental exercise in order to be understood. You get to see what a film wants you to see. You know that that character has brown hair in this scene because you're seeing it in front of you. Because they are already used to making these kinds of assumptions, book readers tend to be better prepared to accept that what they're being told may not be what the story deems true, as is often the case with unreliable narrators. A film, however, doesn't have that advantage. It's much harder to fake things out in film. With a book, you're left having to accept that the picture you painted in your head was false, but with a movie, you have to accept the faultiness of the things that you just saw with your own eyes. Now, with all of this in mind, it's just really hard to do unreliable narrators well in film. Plenty of films have tried, American Psycho, Fight Club, but if you know anything about the reception of those films, you will know that there is a strong contingent of people that never came around to the understanding that those films were intended to be working with unreliable narrators. So if, just for example, you're taking a series of unreliable narrator vampire novels and trying to turn them into a TV show, you have your work cut out for you. Filmic adaptations of the Vampire Chronicles have been made, but they essentially end up ignoring the entire narrative perspective aspect of the original story. At no point in the 1994 film is it suggested that the audience should be wondering if Louis' accounts of events may differ from the truth. The Queen of the Damned movie, that did its own thing, and we don't need to talk about it. But those were movies, constrained by things like runtime, and they simply chose to adapt other aspects of the story because that one was just too complicated to deal with. But in a show, you have much more time to play with stuff, and Rollin Jones and the writing team for the AMC Interview with the Vampire adaptation seem determined to make narrative voice one of the defining aspects of their story. The main tactic that they chose was to make the titular interview a do-over. The original interview presented in the book did happen back in the 70s, with all of its unexamined biases and untruths, but now, some 50 years later, Louis calls the interviewer Daniel in for another attempt. Both of them kind of feel bad about how the last interview went. Daniel has realized what a shoddy job he did as an interviewer, asking terrible questions, ignoring contradictions, and allowing himself to be steamrolled. And Louis claims to have changed since that interview, and says that he also now finds the tapes to have been lacking. Both of them seem to want this next attempt to be more truthful, whatever that may mean. Now, things do start out pretty smoothly. Louis describes his troubled human life, his strained but loving relationship with his family. Although we don't know exactly what it was that Louis said in the first interview, Daniel's reactions to the story do make you think that maybe Louis being a bit more transparent this time, especially about the trickier subjects like his race and sexuality. Daniel is certainly taking a different and far more offensive approach to this new interview. When Louis equates his vampiric transformation to coming out as gay, Daniel scoffs. In what world is getting killed by a blonde narcissist, coming back to life and eating a tractor salesman a coming out story? Isn't that over-romanticizing things a bit? Louis tries to defend himself. He tries to say that these events, although bizarre, were the thing that precipitated his acceptance of his latent homosexuality. But Daniel is unconvinced. He insists that Louis was stalked, attacked, and seduced by Lestat, not courted and romanced. The power imbalance between this white monster Lestat and his black victim Louis is simply too uneven for their relationship to have been anything but cruel and predatory. But clearly, that is not how Louis remembers it. He continues to hold firm that he does not consider himself a victim. Daniel later confronts Louis for the way in which he seems to be completely rewriting the version of the story that he told in the 70s. 50 years ago, Louis had declared Lestat vapid, vulgar, and unfeeling, and now he's calling him the coal fire that warmed his broken soul. So which is true? Was Louis turning a sexual revelation or a horror show? Was Lestat his abuser or the love of his life? Louis claims that the version of the story that he tells now is the more nuanced and fair portrayal. He pleads with Daniel to let the tale seduce him, as Louis was once seduced. He believes that it is only in allowing himself to empathize with the way that Louis felt that Daniel will be able to stumble into some understanding of the complex experience that Louis underwent. And neither Louis nor Daniel's approaches are entirely right or wrong here. Louis's memories are undoubtedly muted by time, tamed by affection, altered to appear less monstrous as a defense mechanism, but Daniel's approach is overly cynical. It erases Louis's agency, it reduces him to a helpless damsel, and it ignores all the ways in which Lestat was so much more than an inane monster. Daniel's incredulity is an attempt to get at the truth, but is there not some truth even in the most romanticized account? Why should Daniel's embittered, cynical analysis be any more accurate than Louis's nostalgic recollections? Both Louis and Daniel are after the truth. They both want to know exactly what it is that the implied author tends to be verifiable fact. They mutually recognize that they are working with a narrator who is unreliable and fallible, but they are struggling to figure out what then is the reliable truth. In one of these arguments, Louis brings up a moment from Daniel's own memoir, in which he describes a memory and then goes back and identifies many of the details of that memory that are technically untrue. Daniel never owned that car. His daughter wouldn't have been in a car seat. In his book, Daniel refers to this as the Odyssey of Recollection. Recollection is not a task, it's not a destination, it's a journey. Memory is soft, malleable, and has little, if anything, to do with fact. Especially in the case of a vampire, when the human mind is stretched across oceans of time, memory ceases to become a history, and instead becomes a story. It is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. So what are we outside of memory? And what do we become when we are no longer there to recollect ourselves? This question becomes particularly pertinent in the case of Claudia, who now exists solely in memory. Although long dead, we come to know Claudia through Louis's account and through her preserved diary entries. The diary entries are particularly interesting when it comes to narration because they show us Claudia locked in time. Louis's story is fluid and changeable, shifting and evolving just as he does. But Claudia's memories come to us crystallized in the very moment that they happened. Her girlish joys and fears upon being turned into a vampire are set in stone. Her teenage rage against the injustice of her condition are given to us exactly as she felt them in the moment. It is kind of freeing in a way. We're probably getting a much more honest account than Louis is capable of giving us. But it is also a limitation. Who knows how Claudia would now reflect on these things? Who knows what details she failed to record, or what details she made up? She isn't there to defend herself, and instead has Louis being the only person shaping the way that Daniel understands her. Louis tries very hard to defend Claudia's memory. There are certain pages of the diary that he's removed to maintain her privacy, especially the pages wherein she describes being assaulted by another vampire. And this is honorable, except that it's not. I think you could make the argument that giving Daniel the diaries to read at all was an invasion of privacy. In fact, you could say that Louis choosing to tell Claudia's story to a reporter is in itself a violation of his daughter. But if he is going to spill her secrets to the world, does he have the right to decide what makes the cut? For all we know, Claudia would have wanted those pages to be shared with the world so that her story would be complete and her true voice preserved. Louis claims that he doesn't want to see Claudia exploited. He wants Daniel to put the diaries in a proper context. But the world doesn't work that way. Daniel tells Louis that once they put it out there, the book, the world decides what it is, not the author who wrote the words. They could spend the next 40 years choosing every precise word and sentence to present Louis, Claudia, and Lestat as even-handedly and honestly as possible, with every caveat to ensure that they would not be misunderstood. But none of that would matter once the story went out into the public consciousness. Stories do not exist in a vacuum. Louis may be doing this interview for himself, but in the very act of telling his story, it ceases to belong to him. Daniel may come across as a bit cruel and insensitive in his reception of Louis' story, here and there, but he is nothing compared to the wolves that are out there. The people of this world will take this story and make it what they want and need to make it. If the Odyssey of Recollection is a journey that must be shared in order to be fully lived, that means that it can never be a private, and thus fully truthful endeavor. In simply speaking his story out into the world, Louis has allowed it to be changed indelibly. At the end of Season 1, Daniel prompts Louis to realize that he may not have been as honest with himself as he thought for some time. At the end of their time in New Orleans, Claudia and Louis attempted to murder Lestat. The effort was unsuccessful, but Louis had forgotten, or erased, exactly what part he played in that. Turns out that Claudia had been fully willing to finish the job, but Louis, who was still quite in love with Lestat, had halted her hand. It was because of him that Lestat had lived, for better and for worse. Throughout the story thus far, Louis has presented as a fallible narrator. A fallible narrator is one who makes understandable mistakes. It's been 100 years. It makes sense that Louis simply would not be able to remember if it was raining that one night. But at the end, with the reveal that something huge was blocked or forgotten from Louis' mind, the audience must come to terms with the thought that Louis is not just fallible, but potentially untrustworthy. An untrustworthy narrator isn't just mistakenly getting details wrong here or there. An untrustworthy narrator is one who is being actively untruthful. In Louis' case, this doesn't seem to be intentional, but it puts the audience in a place to wonder how much else of this story was dishonest. How much has Louis been lying to himself, and thus to us? Daniel accuses Louis not of seeking the truth, but of seeking therapy. And that would be a pretty honorable pursuit. Let's be honest, all of these vampires need therapy real bad, but that is not the premise of the interview. Daniel and Louis were searching for an honest reckoning, Not yet another San Francisco interview where Louis is too absorbed with his internal struggles to separate fact from fiction. The web of dishonesty at the heart of Louis' character is coming unraveled, and the next truth to surface is that Louis' vampiric lover Armand has been covertly monitoring the interview the entire time. Between this and Louis' acceptance of his part in Lestat's survival, we enter season 2 with Louis ready to approach his odyssey of recollection through a newly critical lens. Louis actually comes to thank Daniel for the truths that he's unearthed. As they made their way to Europe to search for like-minded vampires, Louis and Claudia's relationship was a shell of what it once had been. In her diaries, Claudia resentfully calls Louis dead weight, and he'd once felt this unfair. But now, having realized how much he had betrayed her, Louis understands much more about Claudia's complex feelings towards him. Louis is even newly predisposed to question Claudia's accounts. In her diaries, she had written that she was incapable of dreaming, but as Louis re-examines his memories, he realizes that, at least on one occasion, he does remember her dreaming. In response to recovering this memory, he says, "It was just something she wrote, but it wasn't true. She could dream. Thank you. I want this to remember." He's coming around to the fact that even Claudia's seemingly inalterable diary accounts may not be the entire truth. There may yet be new things to learn about his beloved Claudia. She may have lied at certain points, and it is painful for him to have all these new puzzle pieces revealed, but this is the kind of pain that he wants. He associates this pain with growth. Now, his partner Armand is much less eager to spill. He says he didn't want the interview to take place whatsoever, and he's incredibly uncomfortable with this journey of overturning the long-settled dust of the past. He accuses Louis of having lost control of the interview, and he says that Daniel wants to disassemble Louis to have the pleasure of putting him back together however he wants. And listen, I know Armand lies a lot, but he's not entirely off the mark with that one. Daniel has hardly been an objective party in everything that's happened thus far. He has his own aim to tell an interesting story, and although Armand's concerns may have some of their own ulterior motives, he's right to be wary about this interviewer. The second season opens up quite a few big questions about the role of the interviewer. Daniel is the kind of person who just loves pushing boundaries. He prods and provokes, and oftentimes outright mocks the story that Louis is sharing with him. In one such instance, he pushes too far, and Louis retorts by digging into Daniel's past, regurgitating his most painful memories and poking fun at his personal failures. Armand steps in between them to break it up, but he tells Daniel that he should get back to his job, which is to ask questions and listen to the answers. But the question is Armand right about that? What is the role of the interviewer, and thus, since the interviewer is essentially the audience proxy, what is the job of an audience? Are we meant to sit and take the story as it's served, to ask our leading questions and listen quietly? Or do we get to stand in critical judgment? Do we regard these overly romantic remembrances with cynicism or with blanket acceptance? If we were put in the same place as Louis, having our worst moments splayed out and feasted upon by the crows, would we fare any better? Is it right to treat memory as a story? This show does an excellent job of not just raking its narrators over the coals, but the audience as well. It gives us a kind of participatory role in the story. It toys with your expectations and assumptions and instincts, forcing you to examine the most uncomfortable and ironic parts of the storytelling craft. Louis as a narrator only becomes much more interestingly unreliable as the story progresses. With Lestat now absent from the tale, Louis constructs a version of him in his mind, a Lestat-shaped mouthpiece through which his most secret inner desires and thoughts manifest. This dreamstat is omnipresent, particularly in Louis's worst moments. Dreamstat promises that he will get his vengeance on Louis, but only once Louis has made himself happy. Now it makes a little bit more sense why Louis seems to intentionally choose misery so often. There's a part of him that worries that a moment of full, complete happiness will always herald doom. When Louis and Armand first meet and begin their romance, Louis seems outwardly to be having a lovely time. But inwardly, he constantly envisions Lestat being there, mocking Armand's overtures. Is this perhaps what Lestat would have actually done if he was there? Yeah, probably. But this is also Louis's instinct towards hatefulness and cynicism surfacing in some incredibly unique ways. He would never tell Armand that he thinks it's cheesy to quote Shakespeare, but he sure is thinking it. Not only is Dreamstat evidence of Louis's instability, he also serves to destabilize the narrative that we've already accepted. We look back and wonder how much of Season 1's Lestat was actually true to his character, and how much of that was Louis's own projection. In this season, Daniel Malloy outright asks Louis if he was or is schizophrenic, and he's not just being an asshole. I mean, he is an asshole in general, but he has a good point. Louis's brother Paul seems to have suffered from it, and it's not entirely out of the question to say that Louis could also have had some kind of mental disorder that vampirism didn't erase. This would explain why Louis's memories have proven so porous, and perhaps why he might need Daniel's help in piecing them together. Although the audience definitely still sympathizes with Louis, having been so seduced by his tale last season, we no longer fully trust him. Louis, in fact, no longer fully trusts himself. But it is desperately important to him that he regains some semblance of a true past in order for him to understand the person that he is in the present. That seems to be the means by which most vampires come to understand themselves. While discussing his origin, gazing at an ancient painting of himself, Armand asks Louis the question, "Who am I, Louis? Am I my history I have endured? Am I the job I do not want? I do not know anymore." Are we the stories that we tell about ourselves? The sum of our worst moments? The stories that other people tell about us? How do we find ourselves in the past and the present, if not through other people's and our own perception of us? I think that whether or not Louis realized it, this was the point of the first interview. Episode 5 of Season 2 has Louis and Daniel sitting back and trying to remember the first interview. And we come to the question of why Louis wanted to do this in the first place. Daniel describes 1970s Louis as eager to spill, and he says that the first interview was tape after tape of emotional upchuck. Why would Louis, who's 30 or so apparently happy years into his relationship with Armand, wealthy, well-fed, with the world at his fingertips, have been so overeager to share the dirty details of his last relationship? Louis tries to say that it was just exciting to have a human that he could share these stories with after years of only vampire company, but Daniel doesn't accept that. Daniel claims that Louis was lonely, and I think he hit the mark. He was lonely because he didn't even know himself. I think that Louis sought out this interview because he thought that Daniel would be able to show him who he was. Daniel is, in this case, the painter, the sculptor, the photographer, who's capable of getting an outside picture of Louis and showing it to him so that he can see who he is. Louis seems to have seen in Daniel someone that would listen to him, but also push back at him. A hard surface that he could bounce off of and learn the shape of himself, just as Lestat and Claudia once were to him. Now, Armand was definitely not that. Louis, unfortunately, once described Armand as the world's softest, beigest pillow. And look, I am an Armand lover first and foremost, But Louis wasn't wrong with that one. Armand's upbringing taught him that the only way to be loved was to be what your partner wanted you to be. His maker Marius didn't want Armand to ask questions or challenge him in any serious way. Marius wanted someone that would mold themselves to him, to meet him exactly where he was and never make them take a step further. He wanted someone who wanted to be what he wanted him to be. Armand did that for Marius, he tried to do it for Lestat, and he has tried to do it for Louis. He's become what he thinks that Louis wants, not what it is that Louis actually needs. The original interview ends on a bit of a sour note. Daniel is too young and dumb to get the point of Louis' story. Their conversation does trigger Louis to re-examine his relationship with Armand and with himself. In a blow-up fight in the wake of the interview, Armand's frustrations overflow, and he calls Louis rightfully unstable and reckless. He accuses him of still being obsessed with Lestat, no matter how much he claims to hate him. He says that Louis wasn't looking to self-reflect with this whole interview. He was looking to get Lestat's attention and begin the cycle of chaos and abuse over all again. Louis, in return, calls Armand boring. Louis may be unstable and reaching futilely into the past for the answers for the present, but at least he's trying. Louis says that the time that he spent with Daniel, a couple of incomplete, drunken, awkward hours, he says that that has been more fascinating than the decades that Louis has spent with Armand. With no impetus to move forward, no one pushing him towards growth, Louis has allowed himself to be lost in the horrors of the recollected past. In the end, Louis and Armand come to a sort of agreement. They're going to stay together, on the condition that Armand lets Daniel live. They call him a testament to their relationship's endurance, which sounds kind of weird, unless you think of it as Daniel being representative of Louis' hope that he may one day have an honest reckoning with himself. He will get to have the real interview that he needs, and he'll finally meet someone who will push him into an honest conversation with himself. He knows that he'll never get that from Armand, but as long as Daniel's alive, he has the chance to continue growing. Armand agrees to keep Daniel alive because he has to if he wants to stay with Louis, and because being alone would mean coming into an honest reckoning with himself. It would mean taking a good long look in the mirror, and Armand is the kind of person who would do anything to avoid that. He hasn't been painted in 400 years, and he prefers to keep it that way. Now, a small problem is that neither Louis nor Daniel remember any of this happening back in the 70s. They remember the interview, but none of the fallout, none of Armand and Louis' catastrophic fight, none of Armand's 5-day psychosexual showdown with Daniel. It isn't until the time of the second interview, 50 years later, with the help of a recovered audio track, that Daniel and Louis realize how deeply their memories have fractured. Or rather, how deeply they have been fractured by Armand. This isn't just a case of fallible or unreliable narrators. This is a deliberate intervention by a third party, intentionally altering the narrative to suit his purposes. And it changes everything. From here on out, Louis and Daniel aren't just uncertain, they are outright skeptical of their memories, and nearly combative when it comes to Armand and his side of the story. As they continue their odyssey of recollection, Louis is hypercritical of even the most mundane details of their story. Armand claims to have been bored by the new plays that the theater was putting up, but Louis remembers him being incredibly excited. Is that a case of forgetfulness? Or is that an intentional deception? Daniel questions why Armand couldn't just read the minds of dissident coven members, and Armand explains that his mind was clouded by love. But Louis no longer accepts that squishy, romantic explanation. When Claudia's diary entries end, the story no longer corroborated by a third party, they all begin to wonder where the truth really lies. These cracks open up to fractures when it comes to Louis' recounting of the trial. At the end of their time in Paris, Louis, Claudia, and Claudia's partner Madeleine are kidnapped by the bitter Parisian coven and put on trials for their crimes against vampire kind. There, like a storybook villain, Lestat returns to testify against them. With the coven's encouragement, he tells his side of Louis' story, describing Louis' near-animalistic pursuit of him, his mindless determination to seduce a monster, an entirely alien depiction of events. Armand describes it. Lestat stood on that stage, took all the familiar pieces of Louis' life, defiled them, bent them into a Lestat-shaped effigy. But when Armand says that, Louis disagrees somewhat. Now that he's rethinking everything, perhaps he can agree that Lestat's account had some merit. Lestat, for example, paints a very different picture of Claudia's turning. We received the story of Claudia's turning from her diary entries, where she hazily recalls Louis bringing her to Lestat, asking him to turn her, Lestat putting up a bit of a fight, and then ultimately agreeing. Lestat, however, paints a portrait of Louis at this time as hysterical and completely unable and unwilling to listen to reason. According to Lestat, Louis preyed upon Lestat's fear of loneliness, claiming that he would never leave Lestat's side if only Lestat would give them a daughter. Lestat would never have to be alone again if he only did this one thing. Lestat stood his ground, though, telling Louis that it was impossible. If he turned Claudia so young, she would never be happy, and Louis would regret it for the rest of his days. Finally, pushed to the absolute limit, Lestat turned Claudia into a vampire to please Louis' senseless desperation. At the time of the trial, Louis disagreed vehemently with this account. But now, with a more clear understanding of his own unreliability, he accepts that Lestat was right, and that that's a more accurate version of what happened. Looking back at the past, there are a number of seemingly monstrous things that Louis may have had a considerably larger part in than he allowed himself to remember. By the time they finish the events of Paris, Louis has been shaken to his core, and that means he's primed for Daniel Malloy to drop his final bombshell. He's put together the clues and realized that Armand was not the one to save Louis' life. Despite what Louis had always assumed and Armand had confirmed, Armand would have willingly allowed Louis to die if it had not been for Lestat's intervention. Lestat was, in his own way, a hero. This reveal cements the fact that not only is this story dealing with unreliable narrators, it is dealing with deceptive narrators, and the show is perfectly willing to show its audience a blatantly false version of events, later to be corrected or maybe not corrected. The audience must always be ready to look further than what they're seeing and being told on the surface level. It is impossible to say if Louis, at the end of Season 2, is now in possession of the truth. As we've discussed, the truth isn't always so easy to define, if it even exists. But with a more honest vision of who he really is, and the role he's had in his own life experiences, Louis is able to begin moving forward. He goes to Lestat and takes responsibility for the harm that he's done to his maker, for his tendency to twist all that Lestat said or did into cruelty. He acknowledges the ways that he has projected his own fears and insecurities onto him, and he apologizes for taking so long to discover the truth. Together, they're finally able to share in both responsibility and grief over their lost Claudia. The way that this interview ends, compared to the interview of the book, I think kind of tells you all you need to know about the power of trying to tell a story that's actually true. By the end of the book interview, Louis is no better off than where he started. He's disheartened by the interviewer's lack of understanding, and he just continues to drift, unmoored and unexamined, unknown to himself through immortal time. But because the show gave their Louis Daniel Malloy, someone to push back on him, someone to pick at his discrepancies and mistakes, Louis has discovered a much more complete picture of who he is. He finally has a deeper understanding of himself and something that he can build off of to become better. Unreliable narrators are a kind of tough pill to swallow. Humans, on the whole, don't like feeling like they've been lied to. We become accustomed to literal readings of stories, and it's the point of an unreliable narrator to spit at the concept of a literal meaning. In a way, an unreliable narrator can make you hyper-aware of the fact that you're participating in a fictional story. Unreliable narrators call for you to search for a reliable narrator with which to contrast them. But what is reliable when it comes to the ever-flexible realm of fiction? None of this story is true, so how are you meant to parse out what the truth is? But stories like this bring us face to face with the fact that real life is actually pretty unreliable. It's not always so easy to figure out the objective fact. By refusing to lend any one narrator the authority of truth, Interview with the Vampire prepares its audience in a really interesting way for the real world. And I think that is what makes their adaptation of Book 2, The Vampire Lestat, so interesting. The Vampire Chronicles, while incredibly enjoyable books, are not always the best when it comes to consistency. While most of the books and their narrators rest in the murky gray odyssey of recollection, none of the authors granted full authority of truth, one character is largely exempt from that ambiguity, and that is Lestat. Lestat was, without a doubt, Anne Rice's favorite character, and he receives a lot of preferential treatment in the narrative. Lestat's not perfect, he's not a total Mary Sue, mind you. He makes a lot of mistakes, but generally speaking, by the time he's writing the story down afterwards, he always has the clarity and honesty to look back and see those as mistakes and admit that he was wrong. He is incredibly honest about himself, even if he does have a bit of an ego, because that ego's proven right, because everyone says he's perfect, even the Queen of the Damned and literally the devil himself. And rarely, if ever, does any other character question his recollection of events. Lestat disagrees with people's accounts sometimes, but I can't think of a single instance in which there was serious friction between the truth of the implied narrator and his account as a homodiegetic narrator. So when it came to adapting the show, this was going to be tricky. Rollin Jones and the writers' room for this show had already established a precedent with seasons 1 and 2 of their narrators being unreliable, fallible, and untrustworthy. What you see on screen is often not what really occurred. In light of that, it honestly may have just been weird to have season 3 consist of Lestat sitting down for his interview and laying out a sassy, but entirely honest and accurate account of his life and experiences. I think it would have felt shallow in comparison to the depth that they were able to get out of Louis' Odyssey. But you also don't want to risk making Lestat Louis 2.0. He doesn't have the same mental health issues as Louis. His memory is far less piecemeal and far more reliable. So how are we to make the ever-trustworthy Lestat an unreliable narrator? Well, we can do that by acknowledging that not everyone is Louis. Not everyone wants to spill out their life secrets for the world to gawk at. Not everyone thinks that they will find freedom and health through recounting their life story. So instead of just copying the interview format for season 3, the meta-narrative goes that in the far future, events have conspired that have resulted in what would seem to be Lestat's death. In his absence, he's left behind a series of records of his voice where he tells his side of his present-day story, his rise to fame and the events that precipitated his death. So, Rockstar Lestat happens, something chaotic happens, and then they are selling the records. And so the records are accounting the Rockstar times that are happening right now. It's a complicated timeline, but it's fine. Now, these events in Rockstar timeline do include Daniel Malloy's attempts to replicate his experience with Louis by doing an interview with Lestat. This interview, while informative in its own ways, is not quite as edifying as season 1 and 2's interview, because Lestat is not Louis, and he does not want to share as openly as Louis did. Lestat is nothing if not stubborn and wildly emotionally constipated. He has to hide his true feelings away in layers of jokes and overly flowery language and awkward attempts at pop culture references, these artful turns of phrase that mash together into an impenetrable static that keeps you from seeing the hurt that lies beneath them. He is a master of distraction. But these attempts at distraction are present in both the recorded narration from the far future and in the narration of his life story that he's giving to Daniel in bits and pieces. Lestat, thus, isn't merely an unreliable narrator. He's what we call a discordant one. Dorrit Cohn describes the term. Discordant narration suggests the reader's sense that the author intends his or her work to be understood differently from the way the narrator understands it, in a way that can only be discovered by reading the work against the grain of the narrator's discourse, providing it with a meaning that, though not explicitly spelled out, is silently signaled to the reader behind the narrator's back. Rollin Jones and the writer's room allow this discordant narration to come to life via discrepancies between what Lestat says and what the audience is actually seeing. Lestat brushes off his traumatic vampiric turning as a gift from a like-minded monster, even as the actual violence and horror play out on screen. He acts as if he's only moderately irritated by Louis' lackluster depiction of him in the original interview, even though we can see the way that Louis' words are destroying him, considering how defensive he gets about being a beige mayonnaise villain. But nowhere is this disparity between what he says and what we see clearer than in his complex relationship with his mother and fledgling, Gabriella. He and Gabriella have a horrifically toxic dynamic, especially when it comes to sex. Although they didn't begin a sexual relationship until after Lestat turned her into a vampire, she was laying the groundwork when they were still mortal. From a young age, she was grooming him. In his recordings, Lestat virulently defends their relationship as strange to human eyes, but not inappropriate when it comes to vampire standards, even as we watch how inappropriate their relationship was from day one. Lestat wants and needs his mother there as a mother, even more so now that he's going through a 7-episode mental health crisis. But she just does not care for him as a son, only as a sexual partner. Even as Lestat insists it's fine and it's hot and it's just a little dirt in the sandwich. We can all see how much Gabriella's abuse is causing him real, tangible harm. After trying to establish relationship boundaries with Gabriella, Lestat's narration informs us that those boundaries were ignored because we couldn't help ourselves. But then we watch the scene, and it would seem that it wasn't that they couldn't help themselves, but that Gabriella couldn't, and Lestat was too afraid of abandonment to deny her. I am pretty sure that Lestat is aware of how dishonest he's being. That's why the actual truth or semblance of it plays out on screen. But Lestat's narration is hypnotic. There are times when, despite what you're seeing with your own eyes, you want to believe his lies, and you find yourself believing him. These are the lies he tells to us, and the lies he tells to himself. Lestat is not Louis, uncovering the missing pieces of who he is. He is a man who's only ever learned to cope with his trauma through denial and repression, repression, repression. In light of this, of course, he would be reluctant to divulge his life story through literal autobiography. Now, you absolutely cannot tell J.R.R. Tolkien that I said this because he would rise from the dead to silence me permanently, but in that way, he does remind me of Tolkien a bit. In a reply to a letter inquiring after his personal information, Tolkien wrote, "One of my strongest opinions is that investigation of an author's biography, or such other glimpses of his personality as can be gleaned by the curious, is an entirely vain and false approach to his works, and especially to a work of narrative art, of which the object aimed at by the author was to be enjoyed as such, to be read with literary pleasure." Lestat does not want to be known for facts about his past. He wants to be known through the art that he creates today, through his music. He says explicitly that the songs are his story, and that's not a throwaway line or a pretentious diva moment. However, it should be noted that a literal interpretation of his songs into autobiography is also way off the mark. Everyone in the show is constantly asking what his songs are about. Daniel plainly states that Lestat's song Why Do I Have to Feel is about Lestat's first love, Nikki. But that's not entirely true. It may have originally been composed as a way to lament the loss of his first partner, the way that those wounds never fully heal, but he also sings a line of it directly to Louis. He flies up to him and sings, "I tried to write you the prettiest song in the world, but I got distracted." That is clearly referential to the way that Louis and Lestat were coming together before the publishing of the interview tore them back apart. This song is autobiographical in the way that it captures the way that Lestat has so often felt, but by pinning it to one person allegorically and to one incident, you lose out on so much of the song's potential nuance. The show also says that Lestat's song Your Biggest Fan is about his abusive maker, Magnus, and it certainly is. It describes Magnus's stalking, his presence outside the window, his attempts to ply Lestat with wine. It's a horrifically saccharine adaptation of one of Lestat's most traumatic moments. But I think it's an oversimplification to say that that is Magnus's song alone. Is there not also a bit of Gabriella in it? The refrain of the song calls Lestat Wolf Killer over and over again, a title that his mother pressed upon him. She too preyed upon his fear of loneliness to mold him into what she wanted to be. Maybe most tragically, the song could also contain some of Lestat's deepest fears about himself. In season 2, when Lestat is apologizing for his physical abuse to Louis, he mentions that he is burdened by his maker's temper. And when he says that, I don't think he means his maker's anger. Magnus wasn't an angry person. But he was a manipulative person. He was someone that couldn't take no for an answer. He was someone that lusted after a person that did not want them back, and then destroyed that person because he was denied. The song's refrain has Magnus saying, "I want to give you everything I've got. I know you're stubborn, but you have to ask for it." And the horror, of course, is that Lestat never did ask for it, despite Magnus supposedly insisting that he had to ask for it. But Lestat was cursed with vampirism all the same. But if Lestat has this whole complex about the gift not being forced on people, doesn't it make it a little challenging to swallow the fact that he turned Claudia without her ever having consented to the process? Perhaps within this song, there is a degree of Lestat seeing his maker in himself. Now, I have loved every song that Daniel Hart has composed for this show. I think that he has a direct line into my brain when it comes to music. But one of my favorites as of late is Hit the Lights, which we get a bit of in episode 4. Initially, this song is posed as referring to Gabriella. Lestat describes his childhood abuse, his learning how to kiss, and it plays over the sequence wherein she is abandoning him in the past. But later on in the song, the interpretation of the lyrics opens up quite a bit. Lestat sings, "I should have listened when you told me how you felt. I tried to make it better, I wrote 100 letters. When your melody runs through my mind, oh, how I melt." I think you could easily read this as being a reference to Nikki. One of his greatest agonies in his relationship with Nikki was the way that he ended up abandoning him when Nikki was at his greatest point of emotional crisis. In the book, after leaving, Lestat keeps up with Nikki's well-being through letters, and he holds onto a music box containing the song he wrote to Nikki for years. But the chorus is where the song really comes to life. It reads, "I really love you so goddamn much. It breaks my heart to see you losing touch with all the things you used to care about. I guess just hit the lights on your way out." This reads very strongly to me of Louis and Lestat's time together in New Orleans, as Louis was slowly consumed by his depression, doubts, and self-hatred. The sentiments expressed in this song don't just encapsulate one of Lestat's relationship, but all of them. This sense of overwhelming abandonment he's gotten from every person he's ever loved, and maybe even the world itself. Even the less serious of his songs, like Big Boss, which would appear to be a catty diss track about Armand, it has some pretty painful depths hidden within it. Lestat may say that Armand needs to get his face did, but he also says that only the big boss gets to decide who dies and who stays alive. Armand has, in fact, been the bringer of death for a number of Lestat's loved ones, and in all of those cases, Lestat had some degree of complicity in this happening. And I think that the pain, the complicated pain of that, shines through this song in some really interesting ways. These songs make up the meat of Lestat's story. The literal backstory that he chooses to divulge is fragmented and frankly pretty shallow, but it is in his music that he explores what the past actually meant to him and now means to him. And because he didn't make these songs allegorical, but rather applicable to a wide range of situations, the audience is able to apply his music to their own lives. I'm pretty sure that most of us have never been in a 2-century-long frenemy situationship with a French Bengali smoke show, but we all know what it's like to feel powerless in relationships. We all know how painful abandonment can be. We all know what it's like to see the worst of ourselves in the people we hate most, and how much it can hurt to feel in the way that humans or vampires do. We end up with a sense of kinship with Lestat and his struggles, understanding who he is, not just on a factual level, but on an emotional one. Lestat doesn't want to be reduced to the memories of who he was. He desperately wants to be seen and accepted and loved for who he is, and he expresses this sentiment through his music. That's what made the ending of episode 4 of season 3 so tragic for me, as Gabriella convinces Lestat to become the figurehead of the great vampiric conversion. Gabriella uses the argument that his music has come to mean too much to the other vampires. How can he not become their leader? But Lestat doesn't want his music to be weaponized to mean one single thing, vampire supremacy. He wants his music to be seen as an artful, nuanced reflection of him. He wants to share his music, not to bring people to him, but to encourage them to look into themselves. It would be a truly hilarious understatement to claim that Lestat is troubled. His efforts to channel his story through his music are not entirely healthy. In episode 3, it all comes to a horrific climax. Earlier that night, he brushed off Magnus's abuse with a campy music video. But later on, he cannot help but feel every moment of what actually happened to him. But it's not all bad. The next night, while singing his song The Loneliness at a concert, Lestat does manage to find a beautiful moment of catharsis, as he sings about the power of not holding onto one's burdens alone. Reliving the past, through storytelling or music, can be helpful, but it will never be the entirety of healing. No amount of reminiscing, or clarifying memory, or getting revenge can fix these things unless these characters are willing to pull themselves out of the past and actually move forward. In the first interview and its fallout, Daniel, Louis, Lestat, and everyone else presented in the novel come to realize what happens when you make people into characters. It cheapens them. It flattens them out, it chews them up for easier consumption until they are unrecognizable. But it isn't just the world doing this to these characters, it is themselves. Armand once asked if we are the history that we've endured, and I think that the show is trying to say that we are shaped by that, but we don't have to be just that. We can be more than the sum of our best and worst moments, because we exist in not just the past, but the present, and we have the capacity to change in the future. Vampires are a funhouse mirror for humanity. They're this misshapen reflection that somehow makes it much easier to actually see ourselves as we are. And because these vampires in interview have the time and, in many cases, all the money in the world, we're able to see ourselves untethered in them. And when Louis flounders to remember the past, Lestat represses what has been, and we see Claudia lost into memory, we can learn a great deal about what not to do. We don't have forever to agonize over these things like they do. So maybe we all, whether we are undead or not, need to stop just telling stories and start living them. I gotta say, I am having the ride of a lifetime with season 3 of this show. It's not what I expected at all. And for all the people that have been thrown off by it, I do get it. I just urge you to remember that this is its own story. Since season 1, this show has been a radically different adaptation of its source material. And while it may not be for everyone, of course, I think it's one of the most intentional, carefully constructed pieces of art that I've ever seen. I say it all the time that I don't even care if shows make good decisions these days. I'm just excited to see media that makes decisions. And I do think this show's making good decisions, but it's also just making some crazy decisions. So, if it wasn't clear, I think you should watch this show. You should start in season 1, obviously, but please, God, just watch it. It is so good, and it makes me feel like I'm going crazy. Be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and share it with your friend who's an unreliable narrator. Now don't worry, considering the runtime of this video, it's very unlikely they get to this endpoint where I talk about how unreliable and crazy they are, so it'll probably be fine, but also do consider subscribing if you want to hear me talk about the kind of stuff that I like to talk about every other week. Okay, I know you can't feel that right now, but it is 103 degrees outside, and I record my videos in a garage, so it's not much better in here. So I'm gonna call it quits because that's too hot for a vampire of my age, but thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity, vampiric day.